If someone complains to police, I've been offended by this preacher, they said something Islamophobic, homophobic, transphobic, whatever it might be, the police then think that's justification for arresting them and sometimes holding them overnight and then sometimes charging them as well. The Crown Prosecution Service actually argue that quoting from the Bible could amount to an offence in this country.
Good morning and welcome to Parallax Views, an IEA-sponsored series of conversations about the politics of culture with particular reference to freedom of speech. My name is Marc Glendening, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Tim Dieppe, who is Head of Public Policy at Christian Concern. The assault on liberal values we're experiencing at the moment is right across, or manifests itself across a variety of dimensions in our society. And this includes the right of people with different religious beliefs to openly articulate their ideas and to try and persuade others. First of all, I will be talking to Tim about the particular challenges that Christians now face, and then we will move on to discuss the connections, both philosophical and historic, between Christianity and liberal values. Tim, could I start by asking you to give us an overview of the kind of problems many Christians are now experiencing when it comes to articulating their faith?
Sure, great. Well, thank you, and thank you for this conversation. So we at Christian Concern, and we partner with the Christian Legal Centre as well, we're quite well known for running legal cases that support Christians who've run into problems for expressing their Christian beliefs or manifesting their Christian beliefs. And for example, street preachers are quite well known as an example of cases where there's a problem that the police, if someone complains to police, I've been offended by this preacher, they said something Islamophobic, homophobic, transphobic, whatever it might be, the police then think that's justification for arresting them and sometimes holding them overnight and then sometimes charging them as well. And a most recent case was one of John Dunn, a chap called John Dunn. He preaches in Swindon, and he was accused of homophobic comments. That's not an offence, but some people complained he'd offended them. Police arrested them on that basis and then charged him, and the Crown Prosecution Service actually argued that quoting from the Bible could amount to an offence in this country, which is an extraordinary thing. Now the case was dropped in the end because the women who had been offended dropped it, said we're not going to testify, so it didn't happen. But the fact the Crown Prosecution Service would argue in court or make a legal argument that quoting the Bible should be an offence is quite a shocking state of affairs, we think. And then other cases include, like a landmark case for us was a student called Felix de Gaulle, studying social work at Sheffield University. He got involved in a debate on Facebook in his own personal capacity in which the question of sexual morality came up, and he said he believed that marriage is between a man and a woman and sexual expression is reserved for that. An anonymous fellow student reported him to the university. This could offend somebody. You'd have thought the university would say, so what? Right? I mean, so what?
Yes.
But they didn't. They investigated him. And then not only did they investigate him, they ended up expelling him from university for what he had said in his private capacity on Facebook, just expressing biblical Christian morals. So extraordinarily, that case went to court, and after 4 years of going through Employment Tribunal and all the way up to the Court of Appeal, finally his case was won, and I'm pleased to say that just this year Felix graduated from Sheffield University and is now a qualified social worker. The extraordinary thing is that the university thought that expressing biblical sexual morality should be a bar to a profession. It should be a bar to a profession. And it was only when the judges sort of queried that and said, does that mean Mother Teresa should be not allowed to be a social worker? And the lawyers for the university said, well, if she ever said that marriage should be between a man and a woman, then yes. And the judges were like, well, maybe this is a bit step too far here. And then, they lost the case, and he's now qualified, and that's fine. But the fact that people would think that this should be a bar to profession is what's extraordinary. And other examples include, like, a pastoral worker at a school who, again, posted on Facebook well-known concerns about sexual education at school, religion, sex, relationships and sex education. And again, an anonymous friend, it's always anonymous somebody, didn't claim to be offended themselves, but might offend someone else, reported her to the school where she worked, and they dismissed her for gross misconduct. For gross misconduct. Now, how could it be gross misconduct to say, I'm concerned about children and what's happening in schools?
Yeah, and it's very interesting. I mean, it's not just Christians who are experiencing this. So a group of Muslim parents in Birmingham who didn't want their children to be subject to LGBT lessons were peacefully campaigning, a bit like the Christians who peacefully campaign outside of abortion clinics. And they were subject to all kinds of draconian public orders taken out by Birmingham City Council. They weren't allowed, some of the organisers, to come within a mile of the school. They weren't allowed to produce leaflets. They weren't allowed to communicate with each other. Extraordinary degree to which the state is now suppressing the expression of religious belief as well as other types of belief, and really very disturbing in a society that is ostensibly still an open multi-party democracy, and yet when you see this sort of stuff becoming quite normalised.
Yes.
I mean, I've had a number of students contacting me who've been booted off courses for exactly very similar to the case you mentioned.
It's been set up for exactly this reason, hasn't it? And is doing great work in this area and is getting lots of contacts from, like you say, not just Christians at all, for expressing their views. And there are wider concerns generally about free speech across the nation.
Yeah. You wrote a very interesting review of a book by Carl Trueman entitled The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which argues that we have entered a therapeutic age. And that one manifestation of this is the obsession with self-identity. Do you see a connection between this and the desire to clamp down on Christianity?
Yes, I mean, I think that what's happened here, and Carl Trueman sort of charts the how the culture has changed and how it became, he's trying to answer the question, how did it become acceptable to believe that you can be born in the wrong body? And not only acceptable, like it actually becomes, something you can't tolerate people disbelieving that or not agreeing with that. How do we get to that position? And he says it's, we got to this through a various number of steps, but identity, politics, and almost deifying identity, our own self-identity, like I define who I am, is almost saying I'm my God. I've created myself. And then if you then say, but no, you're not who you say you are, you're kind of insulting my God in that kind of way. You're almost blaspheming against me. How can you do that? And then all this outrage of, this is core to my identity is a product of all of that. And you've got to allow people to be who they want to be and allow people to be who they define themselves to be. It's a self-deification, I think, almost. You've got to allow people to create themselves and be themselves. Well, I can't decide, I had a birthday recently, how old I am. Right? I mean, I can't, right? And I can't just decide...
Much as some of us would like to. Yeah.
Well, I would like to, yes. I know. I can't just decide what gender I am. I can't decide who my parents are. There are lots of other things I can't decide about myself, because I didn't actually make myself and I can't self-define. Where does this end, this self-defining thing, in terms of, trans species, whatever it might be? How absurd does it have to get before people say, no, this isn't right. Actually, this is too against reality and against common sense.
I mean, as a libertarian, I believe, anybody should have the right to define themselves however they so wish in terms of how they behave or what they say about themselves. I could, claim to be the reincarnation of the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte if I wanted to and go around dressed up. So it's not...
It's the imposition on others, that then takes it a step further, isn't it? When you have, you must affirm my gender identity. And there are cases. Is a medical doctor, Dr. David McCareth, who wanted to train to be a disability assessor with the Department of Work and Pensions. When he was asked a hypothetical question, would you call a 6-foot bearded man madam if they asked you to? He said, in conscience, I would not. Goodbye, then. You're not qualified for this. Now, this is about compelled speech. And that's the issue here. We're compelling people to affirm someone's self-identification, self-understanding of who they are. Is that really right? Is that really what a free society should do?
Yeah, and of course that does tie up with postmodernism, because postmodernism argues that you can change reality if the entirety of the society, of the culture, accepts that something is true, because there is no inherent objective truth.
Right.
And therefore, if you can force people linguistically to accept a new reality or the self-identification
because
of
there's
people.
no objectivity, it comes down to, well, this is what I think, and who are you to criticise what I think? And there's no objective standard to appeal to. You're right, yes.
Yeah. It's very interesting that while we see some of these beliefs and draconian ideas as coming very much from the sort of ultra wing of the New Left, these are now actually quite mainstream positions. So I don't know if you know, but about 2 weeks ago, Keir Starmer gave a speech at the Pink newspaper's annual awards, and he actually said that if Labour come to power, they will make it a criminal offence not to use people's preferred pronouns, and he got a sort of rapturous applause for that. So Keir Starmer comes across as a very kind of moderate, centre-left, mainstream politician, and yet it's an incredible thought that we will actually have mandated speech in this country, not just simply the banning of certain things.
It's already happened in soft form. We also had a teacher, Joshua Sutcliffe, who said, "Well done, girls," to a bunch of girls in his class, and one of them subsequently, like 2 weeks later, said, "Well, actually, I'm a boy. I want to be identified as a boy," and he lost his job over that. Probably the first person in the world to lose their job for misgendering somebody. So it's already happening in soft law, and I've told you about David McCarrick as well. But to have it in hard law will be very oppressive. What are you saying? I have to lie about who you are. I must lie about who you are, and I must disagree with God about who you are, is the other way of looking at it. I must express disagreement with how God has made you. Is that how we're going as a society? Is that what we're going to enforce in society, that this kind of compelled speech?
Yeah. And of course that was the basis upon which Jordan Peterson decided to get involved in politics as somebody who, hadn't been involved, because in Canada they are moving towards this position of mandated speech whereby it'll become a human rights violation not to use people's preferred pronouns.
The extraordinary thing, the first judgment that we had in David McCarrick's case, this is the doctor who said I won't call a man a woman, the judge in the ruling said disbelief in transgenderism or belief in Genesis 1:27, which is you're created male and female in the image of God, is a violation of the human rights of other people. So, and then the extraordinary thing about that is, A, it's the belief. It's not even expressing it, right? The judge is saying the belief is violating the rights of other people. And B, it's the belief in Genesis 1:27, which is not just made in male and female, but made in the image of God. And the idea that humanity is sacred in the image of God, to be respected, is the foundation of human rights. And he calls that belief a violation of human rights. So he's cutting off the very root, the branches which he's trying to use. I mean, it is extraordinary. I mean, that got overturned on appeal, so that the belief is now respected, respectable belief in a democratic society. But the appeal judgment still said you can't express it because you might lose your job, which we're going to appeal that as well. But the extraordinary thing is we've got to this idea that even these kind of beliefs are violating people's rights to be who they want to be is ultimately the thing, isn't it?
So we're now in a sort of double speak, double think sort of situation whereby the entire conception of rights as originally conceived by early liberals like John Locke, we'll come on to maybe in a moment, that conception has been completely turned on its head. And so that what is now defined as a human right actually involves the right to impose upon other individuals beliefs that they don't adhere to. So it's the conception, the current conception of human rights is often presented as being a campaign for equality, when in fact it's now a campaign for inequality, because some individuals get to assert whatever it is they want to assert, which is fair enough, but those of us who don't agree with those ways of identifying oneself,
Yes.
Then we go to jail.
Yes. And it's gone, the other step that's made is it's one thing to sort of tolerate people with extraordinary views and extraordinary positions, whatever, but then it goes beyond that. You must approve and you must agree. And that's where it's taken another step further, then ends up violating the rights of other people.
Yeah. In another review you have written, in this case, a book called The Christian Origins of Religious Freedom by Robert Louis Wilkin. You say that the case for religious liberty is generally assumed to be a product of the Enlightenment,
Yeah.
whereas in reality, you see liberal values as having a connection to various strands of Christian thinking. I was wondering if you say something about that.
Yes, so people assume that the Enlightenment sort of brought all this kind of common sense thinking in a way into being, whereas actually Christians were arguing for religious liberty for a long, long time. And Church Father Tertullian was actually the first person in the Western world to coin the phrase religious freedom, and argued for it way back then in the 3rd century, and followed by Lactantius as well, and others. And Constantine had the Edict of Milan, which said you can worship whoever you want. First Christian emperor, worship wherever you want, right? Whoever you want. So then when you get to the Reformation and all of that, the first person who argued for religious freedom for all people, not just Christians, but Jews and Muslims and Catholics, is Thomas Howes, the first person to found a Baptist church in this country, and he wrote a little pamphlet about this and argued this point and ended up in prison for it. And then, this kind of idea, again, he was founding those ideas on the Church Fathers and on Scripture as well. And of course, Jesus, let's not forget, said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, render to God what is God's. Separation of church and state is there, in a way. Separation of your duties to God and your duties to your emperor is in there. Separation of what the emperor can control and what the emperor can't control, the same in terms of religious freedom is kind of in embryonic form right there. And then you get to John Owen, a leading theologian of the Puritans, who argued for religious freedom and pointed back to Scripture and to the Church Fathers for it. And then John Locke was actually a disciple of John Owen, as in learnt under him at Oxford University. And it's said that John Owen required his pupils to say that they would support freedom of conscience. And so when John Locke wrote his letter concerning toleration, he used all these ideas, and but he did couch it in an Enlightenment worldview, where he sort of separated it somewhat from the church history and from the Scripture, which is what he'd been taught, still using the same ideas, kind of viewed as liberating it from that, but actually kind of losing that in some ways, and people view that as this is the enlightened way, but it actually can't be understood without the Christian background and the Christian backdrop to it that brought it into that place.
Is the Christian perspective then that God has given us freedom of will so that we can behave both in a virtuous as well as a sinful
the Christian
way?
Position is that worship of God cannot be coerced, right? It's not genuine worship. What God is interested in is relationship. I can't force you to be my friend. I can't force you to love me. And God doesn't want that to be done either. He has given people the freedom because he wants free worship, right? So trying to coerce somebody to worship him is just totally contrary to what God wants, and totally contrary to what we should do, and totally contrary to how God has made us with that freedom and with that free will. And so we should never do that. We should allow people to choose, persuade, persuade, discuss, argue, all that kind of thing, but never coerce. And that's the Christian position on this.
Do you see a connection between these sort of radical Christian ideas, which I suppose came to the fore with the Reformation? I mean, you get a split, don't you, within Christianity around these kind of ideas, and the Protestant, particularly Protestant notion that there's an equality of souls, that we all have a soul, whereas previously there'd been the idea that there was a sort of chain of being from God downwards, and I suppose that comes to the fore, doesn't it, in the Civil War, when Charles I asserts that he is the representative of God, and by implication, that he has the right to overrule Parliament because he's on a different ontological level from members of Parliament, let alone ordinary people.
Well, I think there is a different equality in Protestantism that comes in particular from the priesthood of all believers. So the Catholic Church, asserts particular people are priests and have particular relationship and particular responsibilities and so on, whereas the Protestant position would be that, from the Bible, you are a kingdom and priests of God, and every Christian is effectively a priest, directly accessing God, directly can pray to God, directly can administer sacraments, whatever they want to do. Not disregarding there'll be church leaders and that kind of thing, but, and a kind of equality and emphasising the image of God in all people, which is, kind of in a sense the foundation of what brought us to democracy, the image of God. If everybody is sacred in the image of God, everybody has been given freedom and reasoning ability, then, one man, one vote. Let's give everybody a vote, equal votes, rather than just some people having a vote, or leaving it to a liberal elite or whatever it might be, is founded on a Christian perception of humanity and how humanity works. Not saying democracy is perfect. Obviously, it can lead to things that go wrong as well. That's another aspect of original sin and the sinfulness of humanity and so on. But it's perhaps the best way in terms of restricting the sinfulness of man.
Yes, I mean, I'm slightly obsessed by the Levellers as a group, and it seems that the Reformation and then in this country, the Civil War, unleashed a logic of democracy that couldn't then be contained, because once you had this radical idea that all human beings had been given free will and all had souls, then of course the argument for restricting the franchise and speaking rights to a small elite sort of collapses. And I think sort of what happened with the Leveller movement within the parliamentary army is a very sort of magical and wonderful thing, which came to a head with the Putney debates. I forced the interns here to go to St Mary's Church in Putney to see the site of that.
Very good.
Of those debates, because it was possibly the first time in human history that ordinary people forced their political leaders, in the form of the the Parliamentary Army Council, to come and debate with them on equal terms, and that's an extraordinary moment, I think, in British history, and then it leads on to the American Revolution.
Not well known either. It's not taught in schools. People have not heard of it and don't know about it, but it is an extraordinary, foundational aspect of our freedoms and democracy that we've landed with.
I want to move on to ask you about your personal beliefs as a Christian with regards to censorship. When I was growing up, I associated second wave authoritarian left-wing feminists on the one hand, and then on the other hand, some Christians like Mary Whitehouse and Lord Longford with censorship. It seemed to me they wanted to dictate what kind of films I was allowed to watch, what kind of magazines I was allowed to look at as a teenage boy. In particular, both of them wanted to ban what was then in those days referred to as smut. It's not a word you hear nowadays, but there was a lot of thing about smut on television, and So I had a kind of rather dim view, not only of feminism, but also of a certain type of Christian. Where do you stand in relation to what the state should prevent us from being exposed to or expressing?
So, have you read The Case Against the Sex Revolution by Louise Perry?
I have not.
Right. Well, I found it, very, very disturbing. She's a secular, left-wing feminist, writes for the New Statesman, and she, articulates very well with all the statistics and figures and examples just how damaging the sexual revolution has been, particularly for women. And the statistic that strikes me the most is like 50% of women aged between 18 and 24 have been strangled in sex in this country. Now, how do we get to that? And who says that's good for the country? Who says that's good for the women? You know, and that's obviously pornography. Pornography is like 1/3 of the internet in total now. It's been such a damaging thing, and a family breakdown is costing us, what, 50 billion a year, according to recent estimates. It's a huge, you know, the root of so many social problems is family breakdown, ultimately. Gangs and drugs and alcohol, all these other things. Family breakdown, they don't have a father, they don't have someone who's disciplining them, who's looking after them, who they respect. And so, you know, my sort of, you know, broad brush view would be Mary Whitehouse was surely right to try and restrict this and try and say, let's not go there, let's not go down this path. And you know, then, you know, what I'm most concerned about is the children. You know, why are we sexualising young children? Why are we not making sure that they're not exposed to pornography? Huge numbers of teens are exposed to pornography. They can never forget the images they see. It changes the way they view sex. It changes the way they view relationships with women. It damages their ability to have long-term relationships, to build up a family and bring up new children. Why are we just allowing that to happen? Shouldn't we be trying to constrain it and trying to stop it and trying to say, no, this isn't good for us. This isn't what a society should be. But we're not working hard to do that at this point, and I'm very concerned about that.
So do you not see a contradiction between your advocacy of the right to religious and more broadly political, philosophical freedom of expression, but your belief that the state should intervene to restrict certain other types of free expression? It would seem to me, that, speaking as a libertarian, that there is a major who are to be the moral guardians?
There are constraints. There are constraints on free speech ultimately, right? Threatening violence, everyone agrees, right? There's a limit there. You stop that, right? Now, I would say certain types of obscenity you'd also want to try and restrict and say, no, this is not what society should be. You know, allowing people to display on the streets or whatever it might be, or you know, show to children or whatever. You would say some limits to that. Everyone would say some limits to that. The reason we say some limits to that is actually because of Christianity. I mean, paedophilia was widely practiced in the ancient world, for example, and now it isn't because of Christianity, right? The reason we have an age of consent is because of Christianity, right? The reason that women's rights is protected in marriage is because the reason women have a right to divorce is because of Christianity. You know, we're still living off the sort of benefits of a Christian worldview, but we're losing it as we dismantle and go away from Christianity and say that. Then we're dismantling these things, dismantling objective views for morality, and therefore people are saying, well, this is what I want to do, you should just allow me to do what I want to do. Surely there should be some limits on that somewhere.
But going back to the case of John Donne and the very disturbing statement by the Crown Prosecution Service that talking about Christian beliefs in public can be offensive.
Quoting the Bible,
Quoting the Bible can be offensive. Obviously, what is and isn't offensive is a very subjective thing. But as is also the concept of what is obscene. I mean, Mary Whitehouse wanted, you know, to ban me from saying kind of what I would have then considered to be fairly mainstream comedy and, you know, other type and films I wanted to see. So is there not a danger here that we will be giving a state elite the capacity to make these choices for us?
No, you need the consent of society to do it, don't you? You know, you need to persuade people that this is what's good for society. And it's gone too far here. You know, you can't just have a liberal elite saying this is the right thing, this is the wrong thing to do. No. You know, society needs to agree, and it needs to be democratically agreed to do it. And I think sadly we're a bit of a long way from doing that at the moment. But when we see so much damage to the children and so many people complaining, and people like Louise Perry, you know, waking up and saying, hang on a minute, this is a problem, I wonder if we will start to see a turnaround here. And you know, we'll see. And obviously, what we have seen is, you know, the fall from grace of Stonewall, the virtual demise of mermaids. You know, there is some of this sense of some of this extreme stuff has gone wrong and should be stopped. And how do we ever get to this place where an organisation like Mermaids is going into schools and promoting transgenderism to young children, and all these, you know, great and good and elite people are promoting it and encouraging it and saying, yes, this is the right thing to do. There is questioning going on in society now about some of this stuff, and that's a good thing, and that's healthy. And I hope it leads to a change in culture and a change in the way that people perceive it.
So, moving to a conclusion, are you optimistic that that liberals, political liberals, can turn the tide against the sort of the woke revolution. I mean, you've indicated you see some signs of a fight back. And yet, at one and the same time, we now have the prospect of the online safety bill, which I'm certainly very concerned about. And potentially, I see that as something that could be used very dramatically, not just against Christians, but, for example, against feminists who don't take the transgender line, because you and I could potentially be sent to jail for causing severe emotional distress as judged by the police and the Crown Prosecution Service. Well, how do you, again, objectively measure what is emotional distress? And, you know, do you have concerns about the online safety bill and where we're going legally?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I agree with you on that, and there is a real problem that we are bringing into law subjective definitions of what could be a criminal offence, and I think that leads down a very dangerous path in terms of what's freedom of speech and so on, and people complaining, well, this is what's happened to me, and therefore you shouldn't be allowed to say that. And so, yes, I'm very concerned about that. And I think, you know, you asked, am I pessimistic or optimistic? Well, on the one hand, as you just said, I can see a bit of a fight back, I can see a bit of pushback, and I can see a bit of kind of overreach of some of these kind of agendas that are collapsing in their own sort of, you know, self-contradiction in a way. And on the other hand, the pressure in culture against Christianity is very strong, and certainly if we see a Labour government, I see a lot further moves along this way that will be very damaging for society and for our children, and I'm very concerned about that. So I sort of have some hope, but probably broadly pessimistic at this point in terms of the direction of travel and where we're going.
And very lastly, how does Christian Concern campaign on these issues? What is it you do in relation to all this? So, you know,
perhaps our highest profile is our legal cases, like the ones I've discussed earlier, and they do set precedents, like Felix de Goey set a precedent in law that you can't just bar someone for a profession for expressing what they said on Facebook, and that's very significant. But we also campaign and lobby and, you know, respond to consultations and all of those kind of things as well, and try and educate people and you know, talk to people and run conferences and events and go and speak at churches and try and show people what's happening in society and what they can do about it, and encourage people to speak up for what they believe, almost while we still can in a sense, but to, you know, to say and to express and to raise their concerns at the appropriate level with their school or with their local politicians or whatever it might be.
Tim, thank you very much for joining me and for our exchange of views, and good luck with your campaign for religious freedom, and thank you very much for watching.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.